As we talk about how we can love strangers, I think it's helpful for us to take stock of where we are and what we might be up against. So, growing up, one of my jobs in the grocery store was to stay with the cart while my mom would search around for stuff. My mom always had a medium sized Coach purse that she would plop in the top of the child seat. And if I wandered away or got distracted for a little bit, she would always get really upset, and she would drop her voice into that mad whisper and be like, "Eric, somebody could have snatched my purse." Now, we shopped at Harris Teeter. I don't know who she thought was going to snatch her purse, but my mom also refused to say the code to our house alarm out in the yard for fear that somebody might overhear it. We lived on 4 acres out in the woods. Nobody was going to overhear it. I was raised to fear strangers. I don't know about you, everyone is different. My wife told me her mom used to pick up hitchhikers in their car all the time when she was a kid. So I know not everybody is like me. But I would argue that fear of the stranger, or at least indifference towards the stranger, is a component of the American mentality. I say all this to say, when we read biblical commands to love others, to love the stranger, we need to know what we're up against. We need to know what we're up against with our community groups and in the world around us. But more than that, we need to know what we're up against in ourselves. I'll confess, when I get an unexpected knock on my front door, my heart rate goes up. I get nervous, I get anxious. Thinking about the parable of the soils, where Jesus talks about seed falling in 4 different soils, I think we should really consider the seed that falls in the soil and then gets choked out by weeds and thorns. When we talk about how to love our neighbor, in that word picture, Jesus is saying that this seed is sprouting up. That's like the gospel sprouting up in our life. And then the cares of the world, these thorns and weeds grew and choked it out. When we think about how we can love the neighbor next to us, how we can love a stranger, we should think about what would get in the way of doing that. Now, as God calls us to respond to Him in faithfulness, when He gives us opportunities to really trust Him and do something that might be challenging, if we struggle with idolatry, our idols will have something to say about it. And I think when we talk about how to love the stranger, we need to think about how we can idolize ourselves, our things, our time, our energy. And when we have an opportunity to be faithful to what God has called us to, when it is challenging, the idol of self will ask questions. Ourselves will ask, well, is this going to infringe on my time, my energy, my possessions, my money, my desires? Is it going to get in the way of my ambitions? And if the answer to any of these questions is a solid yes, I think the idol of self will say no to the opportunity because it robs them of worship. It robs us of worship, and we are more inclined to stay subservient to ourselves rather than submit ourselves to God in faithfulness. And again, I'll be very honest, as I think through this, I am often shocked at how much I love myself in comparison with how I love others. I am so well versed in loving myself and prioritizing myself over others. It makes me think that God has His work cut out for Him. But maybe I can assure you with this as well, that God is up to the task. So when we reflect on what could get in the way of us loving others, what's the cure to that? Let's turn to Romans 12, verses 1 through 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Skipping down to verse 9. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. So what's the cure here for our idolatry? Looking at Romans 12, Paul says, therefore. That therefore looks back to chapters 1 through 11, where he has talked about how we are saved by grace through faith in Christ, that we are justified as an act of grace from God to us. And he says, reflect on the mercy we've received in God. Therefore, by the mercies we have received from God, then we present our bodies as living sacrifices to God. So we first reflect on the mercies we've received from God. And then we commit ourselves as a living sacrifice to God, following Him however He calls us to, being obedient to Him and renouncing the idols of self. And then, particularly when we're talking about loving others, we get started. We love strangers. We reflect the love that God has given us out into the world. Jay Koenig has a great way of saying this. He says, for us to partner with strangers, that we have to remember that we are the guests of God, that we've been received as strangers by God. John Piper has another way of saying this. He says that for the hospitality that we have received from God to come to fruition, that we have to be hospitable to others, otherwise it decays and it dies. I'm encouraged that God's strength is perfected in our weakness. As we think about how often it is difficult for us to love others, we can remember that when God deals with us, it is a fishes and loaves situation. Right? When Jesus took 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 people, He can take what very little we bring to the table and He can multiply it. And He can bring amazing things through what little we have to offer. And I hope that as that takes the attention off of yourself and puts it on to God, that is incredibly freeing. Now, I hope that as we think about how we can love others, that this isn't one more thing for you to do, but that this is the gospel applied to our lives, that it unilaterally changes everything that we do. We remember that God can leverage everything in our lives. He can leverage our career, PTA meetings, family dinners, the one time you actually get your neighbor to wave back at you. God can multiply all of that and reap a harvest that we could never dream of. I'm hoping that we as community group leaders can all encourage one another to be in it together, that we can help one another, that we can encourage one another with our stories when we see God show up in faithfulness, that we can share with one another the tips and tricks that we figure out on how to go about loving others. And that we can, as the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 4, that we can continue to exhort one another to stay faithful to God as He calls us to love our neighbor like we love ourselves.